All right. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name's Adam Frizzell, and I'm the General Manager here at AeroPM. I'd like to thank you all for dialing in today for AeroPM's latest Learning Together presentation. As most of you are aware, AeroPM hold these Learning Together presentations to share our knowledge on topics relevant in the current environment. We also offer these presentations freely to anyone within the defence community to support the wider knowledge and growth of the wider workforce. Today's topic is being presented by three of our industry-leading test and evaluation experts, and the topic is the challenges and options for conducting complex systems of systems testing. Now, I'd like to hand over to Mick Wiggins to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. For those that have dialed into one of these before, they'll understand the format. Quick introduction from myself and my colleagues. Firstly, myself, Mick Wiggins, as Adam has said, I'm a graduate of the Empire Test Pilot School in the UK as a qualified test pilot. I'm currently employed within Air 5349 as the T&E manager and also the project lead as the advanced MTES part of the project. And I have a background in both capability systems within defence and commercial aviation. And I'd like to hand over now to have my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Matt Kitchen. I'm ex-Air Force, sort of maritime P3 and a small amount of P8 testing. I'm a graduate of the US Naval Test Pilot School. I'm a flight test systems specialist, and in my current role, I'm test and evaluation manager of Joint Project 9141 Phase 1, or Planned Delphic generally. So looking to roll out communications devices across the entire ADF and other groups and services. My main experience in tests is obviously aviation systems with a bent towards training systems, unmanned systems, and then maritime patrol. And to you, Nug.
Thanks, Kitsch. Hello, folks, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Nug. I am a distinguished graduate of the National Test Pilot School and a flight test engineer to boot. I look after the T&E capability here at AeroPM, which is extensive and well-resourced, and for that reason, I've been contributing towards the T&E RFI and the work in that space that Defence is looking to move to. But my background is in weapons clearances, primarily off F-18 Hornet and a bunch of adherence work, and I'm really excited to be covering this topic and hopefully teasing out some of your experiences in this space as well. So today we're going to cover these four topics, broadly speaking. We're going to go back to a little bit of background and setting up systems of systems and why this matters, why it's important, who our audience is. We're going to look at the challenges and some of the options where possible that are new, that are introduced as a result of doing systems of systems testing. And we're going to do that really through three phases, the classical phases of a test and evaluation campaign. So Wiggs is going to look at the planning aspects. I'm going to look at conduct, and Kitsch is going to cover off on reporting and regression testing. And then we're going to end with some sort of common themes to tie it together and hopefully then open the conversation up about some other thoughts around what programmatic or systems of systems testing might require. Over to you, Wiggs.
So those familiar with test evaluation, this definition wouldn't be a surprise to you, but it's always an important question to ask, why do we test in the first place? And the way that we put that from an Air Force perspective, but it's relevant to all three services in defence, is that test and evaluation provides the essential practical and real information about the safety and effectiveness at all different levels that we have our systems in play in the capability life cycle in defence. The elements inform us of the decision-making that we need to make. They provide an objective quality evidence for us to make that assessment of the capability. And in this space that we're going to delve into, we're going to look at how those individual systems form part of the systems of systems testing. Next, thanks, Kitsch. So we'll start off with defining what systems of systems testing is. And Kitsch, I'll hand over to you for this part.
Thanks, Weeks. I guess the primary question that comes up when you start looking at systems of systems testing is how is it actually, distinguished from normal testing of stuff, which is a system of subsystems. And so what we've got up there is a definition that's drawn from the US System of Systems Engineering Guide, which is that, system of systems deals with planning, analysing, organising and integrating the new capabilities of a mix of existing and new systems into a system of systems capability greater than the sum of the capabilities of the constituent types. As you pick apart that definition, there's a few features that become apparent. Probably the most defining characteristic I'd suggest of a system of systems, as opposed to a system of subsystems, is that each of the constituent systems in a system of systems is not necessarily managed by the person who is responsible for that system of systems. They're each managed potentially individually, and they will have their own objectives and their own responsibilities that exist outside of the system of systems manager, and in many cases are likely to have competing interests with the system of systems. And so that can create a fair amount of tension at times. Some other features of it that are also important to recognize when it comes to test and evaluation planning is that in a system of systems, the constituent systems in that are likely to be in various phases of acquisition, in-service support and disposal throughout the life cycle of your system of systems. So things will be introduced continually, things will be changing within that system of systems continually, and then things will be falling out of it all the time. And so that becomes a very big challenge in orchestrating what the actual boundary of your system of systems is. It's changing all the time, as well as the configuration internally changing all the time. And the last feature of it is really why you actually bother having with systems of systems, and that is that you're trying to do something that the individual things or components of that system of systems aren't able to achieve on their own. So we're trying to build some sort of synergy by assembling constituent systems to perform a task. Over to you, Nug, to talk about taxonomy.
Thanks, Kitsch. And this manual that Kitsch refers to goes a step further to break out and characterize systems of systems as a type. And there's some common linkages, and these aren't the only linkages, but there are ways to be able to characterize it generally. So those, perhaps you're just on your phone and in the car on the way home from work, and I apologize because this is largely a visual slide, this particular one. They define 4 separate systems of systems, and you'll see them written there on the left: directed, acknowledged, collaborative, and virtual. And there's some generalizations that we can make. So with a directed system, you would have more of the autonomy of the component systems and perhaps the overall systems of systems. So that's you can see as you would slide down, you would have more control for a directed than you would necessarily for a virtual. And I'm going to give you an example of what these might be soon. To generalize again, the ability to conduct, say, what we would classically call DT and AT, usually easier with a directed systems of systems than it is necessarily with the virtual. In fact, as we slide up, we're really talking about perhaps being able to do some AT/OT around an acknowledged system. Perhaps for a collaborative type system, the best we can hope for is integrating ourselves into the exercise design. And for a virtual system, we're possibly talking about observation of real world behaviors rather than being able to conduct definitive test and evaluation, more recording what is happening in the real world. So let me give you an example of some of these. So a directed system might be something like the program Weeks is working on with the MTES, where there's a number of systems, beg your pardon, that come together. We have direct control of each of these devices as they're providing input to Growler, and we can relatively easily conduct DT, AT of these component systems and of the systems of systems. An acknowledged system might be something like our integrated air and missile defense. I guess any multi-domain program really is a typical example of an acknowledged system where each can work individually, but when integrated together, the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Other examples might be, say, in the joint EW space or in space situational awareness, where you could have individual radars and sensors working individually, producing their own data, but you're bringing it all together and fusing that data to create a better picture of the space situational awareness. And we can do T&E on that really quite comfortably. It shouldn't be too hard, and parts can drop out, and some of the component systems can drop out, and we can still evaluate the effect. Looking at a collaborative type systems of systems in a military context, we could be talking about something more broadly, as broad as, say, maritime patrol, where we're not relying on any one platform to be able to provide that. In fact, it could be a mix of platforms, a mix of services, say, Air Force and Navy in this particular case, might even include the civil agencies as well to be able to support that. So really kind of quite difficult to have dedicated T&E serials around that. And so you're starting to integrate yourself into a broader exercise program to be able to validate the joint force effectiveness, or provide joint force assurance of the capability. And then really the virtual, if you're struggling to try and understand what they're talking about there, that type can be things really quite as obtuse as, say, the internet or blockchain, where we have real difficulty being able to set up as a systems evaluation to determine the effectiveness of the overall product. Again, to generalize, the systems themselves in a directed solution, geographically speaking, can tend to be close together, maybe close in terms of a command and control perspective as well. And that becomes less and less likely as we move through those types. Equally, our interfaces between each of these systems are generally really well understood for a directed system. But then as we move up the chain or through the different types of systems, it can become less apparent. And for that reason, generally the difficulty in being able to conduct test and evaluation on some of these systems as you move through those types gets harder the further we move up that chart. So why go to the length of defining our systems of systems generally? It is because they will require a horses for courses type approach. And what might work in a system that you won't characterize as being directed, those same principles might not equally apply or make it as easy to conduct test and evaluation, say, for a collaborative type of systems. Slide, please. Now, Wiggs is going to go through some of the challenges and options through the planning phase for consideration.
Thanks, Nub. Okay, so as has been outlined there, systems of systems, to sum it up in a word, is complex. But we can add to that level of complexity just the amount of control that you have over the system of systems that you're trying to test. In the case of planning for systems of systems, planning anything, whether it's a simple system or a complex system, is obviously difficult. And the first thing that we need to understand when we're talking about something as complex as systems of systems testing is how it's actually constructed. So what I mean by that is the system individual standalone systems? And Nug gave us an example of that previously. Is it a modified standalone system, as in do we have some standalone systems, but they don't meet our requirement and we're going to be conducting modifications to that? Or are we going to have a purpose-built system where we have control over all of those subsystems that we make the constituent parts of it? When we talk about that construct for how our systems being put together, it becomes pretty obvious that an individual standalone system becomes probably the most difficult for us to be able to do the planning exercise in a T&E perspective for it. Part of the reasons for that would be the competing interests or priorities of the individual suppliers for those individual systems within the system of systems. And they're unlikely to have a significant amount of buy-in to the capability that your systems of system is trying to produce. Individual systems, they've got obviously a great understanding of what they're trying to produce, but that outcome might not be aligned particularly well to what you want to do in the integrated sense. The other difficulty that we have when we're talking about individual constructed systems is our access to the supplier's information that they've got from the building their own system, doing their own T&E and then reporting on it. There might be commercial and confidence issues or intellectual property concerns that they may have in sharing that data with you. And when it comes to planning a T&E activity that involves individual systems in the SOS sense, the more information that we can have going in, that higher fidelity of data that we can have, the better decisions that we can make, because we will obviously have a greater understanding of what we're expecting the systems to do and then how that would interact with each other. Another specific aspect that we have with systems of systems, and it's been touched on by Kitsch earlier, is that systems of systems tend to be an incremental program. You don't start out with a big bang. You start off with individual systems or one or two systems that you'll get up and running, and then you'll combine those systems and add to them over time. Part of the difficulty with doing an incremental approach is that now we end up with disparity in our life cycles for the dependent systems that we have. So we may have legacy systems that we're not doing anything to in that system. There could be elements that are under development where we are expanding a capability of an existing set, or we could be introducing new technology altogether into that set. Those different life cycles for the different elements of the systems or subsystems, when we can try and combine them into the systems of systems area, we could end up with a misalignment of the capabilities. And this can obviously produce some difficulties in us with our level of understanding and how to plan in the first instance, or what the likely success will be from any planning activity that we do. Next slide, thanks, Matt. So as I've said, I've touched on the life cycle issues that we could face in this area. As I said, one of the major concerns you have in this area is that misalignment of those capability objectives. Thanks, Kitsch. The last area in the planning phase I want to touch on is a little bit more focused on the complexity side. The scale of the complexity produces an inherent difficulty in being able to identify dependent variables within our system of system. What do I mean by that specifically? We may well have a good understanding of how a particular subsystem works, but we do not necessarily know how it's going to interact with other systems in our systems of systems. And as a result of that, when we're talking about high level of complexity, we don't really have a firm understanding of what systems are dependent on others to produce the required outcome that we're expecting. There could be a difficulty in synchronizing the individual systems so that we do get that level of harmonization to improve our understanding. And ultimately, producing the validation criteria accurately is another difficult exercise in being able to capture those relationships between the designs of the individual subsystems and the capability that we're trying to produce at the systems of systems level. There are some solutions, however. Slide, thanks, Kitsch. Like any element in T&E, whether it be a simple system or a complex system, having an understanding of the system that you've got under test is absolutely fundamental. We have some help here in this area, in that most projects that people would be familiar with will have a JCN or an OCD that will outline the broader capability that we're trying to achieve. And keeping that in mind is really very important in the planning phase when it comes to deciding what we can test and what we can't test, and what parts of the tests will interact with each other to produce this capability outcome that we're trying to achieve. Slide, thanks. With individual test events itself, particularly when we're talking about individual systems that are the constituent parts, having access to the actual subject matter experts or the stakeholders in that supply chain, that's particularly important in helping us in the planning phase. So like any program, good communications with your suppliers and the stakeholders so that people are aligned certainly makes planning for test events a hell of a lot easier. When it comes to actually putting the test plan together and then sequencing the test events, it's much easier to have an incremental build-up from the systems level and then into the systems of systems level. And this might be important from the fact that you might not have controlled some of those individual systems that form the constituent parts. And the individual tests, as they collaborate with others, will help inform your ongoing test planning as you proceed through to the end capability. As was indicated by Nug in the taxonomy, rather, one of the other areas that is important in the planning phase is understanding the value of OT&E type test events, in that sometimes the best plan is to actually just put the system in motion and stand back and watch what it does and then understand that. And that'll be touched on a little bit more by Nug and Kitsch a little later on. The last thing that I'll talk about in this test event area is anticipating failures and planning ahead. So it's always difficult when you have such a large complex system to understand what might come out of it, but having alternate plans in place so that you use your valuable resources most effectively is always important. Slide, thanks. So in the outcome area, when we're talking about planning, as I said, most of the systems are so complex that they're part of an incremental program. And one of the most effective ways in managing incremental programs is via a spiral upgrade program. And therefore, the identification of the individual systems that contribute to the outcomes, they then form the priorities for your T&E activities. Spiral capability management is sometimes very complex. And again, that incremental approach and taking a more observing view in the planning phase is fundamental in achieving successful outcomes here. And the last point that is probably going to be the most apt is that any T&E that you do plan needs to be focused on the capability objectives rather than the system specification necessarily. System specification is clearly important and it will be valid in your subsystems, but at the systems of systems level, making sure that you actually achieve the outcome that you're intending to outcome in accordance with your OCD or JCN is particularly important. I'll hand over to Nug now to talk about how that would be conducted in real terms.
Thanks, Weeks. Conduct phase is going to be difficult, and there's no two ways about it. with many moving parts, many kittens to herd. And some of these will be absolutely unrelated to the systems themselves or the overall systems of systems. And I'm thinking of things like some of your safety services, perhaps for a test evaluation campaign, spectrum management, environmental management could well be there on the scene observing as well. You should have SMEs available to you. SMEs for the individual systems that make up that systems of systems is critical. You cannot be on top of it all, so being able to recall those will be necessary. And then there might be other things less obvious perhaps around security. These people could well be in attendance because of the sensitive nature of the campaign that's being undertaken. You could have foreign nationals, the OEMs for some of those component systems. There's going to be a lot of people in short, and that's a lot of people to brief and keep up to date with how this program is moving forward. Noting Wiggs's comments earlier in the planning phase about that, the diverse group of stakeholders that can and are likely going to have buy-in to the outcomes of this program, or at least want to have buy-in. Wiggs also touched on spiral upgrades and taking it up at a systems of systems level. You know, as testers, we're cued into understanding, say, might be software settings or hardware makes and models for maintaining configuration control, particularly if our campaign is over a long period of time where we might not get access to the same system under test, might be the same tail number, the same ship, what have you. That's fine at when we're doing systems T&E. Systems of systems, we need to be able to understand the relationship between each of those and how that interface between those systems is also changing. So there's an additional level, an additional challenge there to overcome. And in the conduct phase, Kitsch is going to talk about reporting on the effect, tying it back to the customer being, CJOPS or a capability manager, and being able to answer to a joint capability needs statement or the like. That doesn't mean when we're in the conduct phase that we don't need to drill down and understand why did we not achieve that effect? What was the issue at fault? Where's the deficiency lie? Because if you don't do that in real time, it can be difficult post-event to be able to tease out, well, what actually happened there. So being able to quickly identify where you believe the source of those deficiencies, separate from reporting, but being able to know where they are occurring in real time is going to be a challenge for us all. 3 other challenges coming to mind. Thanks, Kitsch. 2, beg your pardon. If we're in the exercise design space, and if the only way that we can get access to the assets to be able to conduct test and evaluation is going to be to couple our T&E program with one of our bigger exercises here in Australia, then we're challenged by the fact we're going to largely need to do that on a non-interference basis. Now, we must get better as programmatic test evaluation managers or as systems of systems evaluators, getting inside the exercise design cycle and being able to influence and shape the activities that need to be done, the test events that need to be done. These should not be, if we're doing this effectively, these should not be viewed as science experiments within an exercise such as ACES North or what have you. This, if we're answering the mail and going back to remember the customer here being CJOPS or capability managers to determine the effectiveness of our fighting force, then there should be great correlation between the T&E objectives that we have for systems of systems and what the design of each of these exercise serials are. So that's a real opportunity that we should exploit, but being able to do so and in the conduct phase our ability to influence is then lost. So we're challenged by the fact that we are going to need to largely sit on our hands and watch the fruits of our planning or otherwise play out. Finally, perhaps linked to our current strategic climate, the outcome of because we're not talking about the effectiveness of this weapon off that aircraft or this shell from that ship or what have you, the effect is largely going to be far more demonstrable, and therefore success may be a good deal more obvious. So there can be some sensitivities around the security of the outcome, and maybe that's a good thing as requested by the services or the Australian government generally, to be able to demonstrate capabilities. But there are times when, particularly if things do not go well, where we may need to try and keep the outcome of that test evaluation more discreet. And we can be seriously challenged doing that in a systems of systems setting, simply because the effects should be large usually, and they tend to be more geographically spaced out as a general rule. So where are some solutions or options for us to consider? I flagged it earlier, but if we do not have the biggest brain in the room on each of those systems, then we're really doing ourselves a disservice and making it tough. For the campaign T&E manager that's looking after the effect, we may not have be as smart as the developer on some of these individual systems, but we need ready access to them. Goes without saying that we rehearse wherever possible. That'll be crucial to being able to bring everyone on the journey as to how this test campaign should play out and why, and who's bringing what assets to the table when, etc. That goes with any military activity, so you shouldn't be surprised that it is equally applicable here in test and evaluation. And linked to that naturally is our ability to brief everyone from the firefighter through to the operator and all the other agencies across the enterprise as to how this will play out. And when noting Wiggs's comment at the outset around potentially having disparate objectives with this program, being able to brief to exhaustion where you intend to or what intends to be conducted just prior to doing so. Some other options, and this one perhaps is really the one that sets itself from the others as being a relatively, perhaps our single greatest solution to complex systems of systems testing is in the synthetic space. Synthetics, be they a digital twin or otherwise, offer a great option to conduct repeatable tests frequently, particularly when our assets are scarce or it comes at great cost. It's not foolproof though, and synthetics can require a lot. Being able to create synthetics takes a lot of investment up front. And that's not just in, say, the systems themselves, but in environmentals, in the human performance. These are not simple pursuits. But if we can do that right, then the benefits are substantial. And that being that we've got repeatable data to be able to throw at our test items and run those tests against future variations of the systems under test. So it is a large investment up front, but with great enhancement or benefit, a long tail of data can flow thereafter. Of course, modeling and simulation, just as it does when in systems testing, being able to do apply that, build that for systems of systems is critical. And I'm thinking about the option here to splice in fighters out of Tucson, Arizona, F-16 fighters into a exercise program. Let's call it an amphibious campaign through Talisman Sabre or something like that is, provides significant benefit to test and evaluate the overall effect of, say, close air support in readiness for that type of undertaking, amphibious assault. Finally, whereas when systems testing alone, we may not care as much about the interface, being able to understand the interfaces between the systems, the component systems of the overall systems of systems is critical, and being able to do that prior and confirm and remove, I guess, interface design as a potential deficiency for the overall effect is something we should do ahead of time, wherever possible, with dedicated testing associated with that. Kitsch, all yours.
Thanks, Nug. So yeah, I'm going to start talking about some of the challenges and potential options associated with systems of system test reporting. Before I get into the sort of substantive elements of it, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily narrowly focused on writing the report itself, although I'll talk to a couple of elements of that, but it really encompasses some thoughts and ideas on how to generically turn data into conclusions. So we might end up leaking into things that touch on elements of planning and conduct as we go along. I'll also like to say that the fundamentals of system of systems test reporting aren't changed when we write a report on systems of systems. It'll primarily consist of a bunch of paragraphs that relate to test conditions, the data, an analysis of that data, some sort of mission relation, and then finish with some conclusions and recommendations. That implies a bunch of things that I'll talk briefly. So mission relation is obviously going to be very dependent on your experts that you have in the room from the constituent systems and the capability manager for the system of systems as well. So, but none of that is fundamentally changed. I'd also like to say that the same approaches that we have to systems engineering generically also apply, and that the starting point for any sort of systems of systems evaluation should be to review the test data from the constituent systems that relate to your system of systems, because ultimately what we're trying to do is develop a system of systems that is greater than the sum of the parts, but we can actually, by reviewing the test data from the constituent systems and the test reports from that, know what the sum of the parts actually is, and that'll very greatly inform where you should be testing and where your analysis should sit. I won't talk to that anymore though, because it's fairly reasonably intuitive. And what I really want to focus on is conducting reporting on T&E between different constituent systems and complex sort of scenarios. The most fundamental issue that will affect most systems of systems testing is the number of constituent systems, the range of potential operating scenarios, and the constantly changing configuration of those constituent systems. And the result of that is that in all but the simplest scenarios, you're going to generate a multi-dimensional test matrix that is unmanageably huge. You will have, as Weeks sort of touched on, identifying and the number of dependent variables in a system of systems with any degree of complexity, it rapidly turns into a combinatorial explosion. And so the fundamental challenge is, how can we write a test report that is meaningful to a capability manager based on what we've observed? And the reality is we're going to probably need to extrapolate. And as a flight tester, that sort of makes me uncomfortable. It's certainly not in line with my experience. You know, the traditional methodology where we'd start in the middle of a proposed envelope, gradually work out, and we'd test all along the envelope and inside it to validate that what we expected from the performance was what we get. That is not going to work in system of systems. We are going to have to take measurements from a set of planned areas or wherever we can get them, and use that data to make some general conclusions that are outside of what we tested. And that is almost inevitable. And that's something that we need to get a little bit more comfortable with. So how can we do things to help us feel a little bit better about extrapolating? Before I get too far into talking about it, I'd just like to add that I'm not advocating for applying less rigor to your conclusions or being disingenuous or taking less pedantry to how well you document the test and documenting precisely what happened during the test event. That is absolutely foundational to the test. You still need to be able to document exactly what happened and use that analysis to figure out why it happened. At all times, if you're doing test reporting, you need to very clearly articulate where your observations or your conclusions are based on actual hard observed facts, and when you're using those facts to make some sort of conclusions that perhaps are a bit outside what you tested. It may even be that conclusions supported by extrapolated data should be in a separate section, or even in their own report post the event as a potential way of doing that. One of the most powerful things that we can do is to refer to some sort of model or simulation of the performance of the system. And then essentially, in addition to reporting what actually happened, also report on the observed differences between the actual and the predicted performance for a given set of test conditions. So for example, for a system of systems that is an air defense system, we're likely to have some sort of measured or estimated values for detection ranges, tracking accuracy, handover performance against a range of different types of targets, and in a range of operating conditions. And we can run those parameters through a simulation of a proposed test point or a series of proposed test points to estimate, for instance, the tracking accuracy of an IADS for a specific target with a given speed and altitude profile, for instance, if that's the sort of thing that we're interested in evaluating. So we have a model for what we expect to see, and we can then go out and test what we actually see and measure the difference between the actual and predicted performance. And we do that to determine the likely performance over a range of conditions that were not actually tested. And from that, we don't necessarily conclude that an IADS is capable of doing something or that we observe that it's satisfactory at doing it, but we can make conclusions that certainly for conditions that are fairly close to those we tested, assuming that the model turned out to be fairly close to what was predicted, then we can assume that it's probably good or probably not good for a particular set of circumstances. One of the more powerful things is this, is that we can then use the measurements that we did obtain to go back and then update our model or our simulation, and then we can use that as the basis for testing again. And as those things converge, then we're able to greatly multiply the effect of the data that we get. So we can start to really achieve a sort of multiplying effect on our data as we refine our model and as that gets closer to reality. Noting that, of course, it's going to change over time given all the sorts of system life cycle of the constituent systems in that. So there are certainly limitations and flaws ceilings as to what you can achieve with that, but it certainly does allow you to get more bang for your test buck. And the other warning, I guess, the disclaimer on that is you have to avoid extrapolating too far. If we test an IADS for a particular set of ranging conditions and it gives us performance that were more or less what was expected, that doesn't mean our model is good for all test conditions. We can, you need to be aware of how far you're extrapolating away from what you actually tested. And that will take a little bit of intuition and guesswork as to what that looks like. But the good thing about it is if you go out and test again next time, you pick a different point in the model rather than refining the point that you had before, and then hopefully that agrees with it. And if it doesn't, you'll know you've extrapolated too far. The reality is we do this kind of thing intuitively anyway, particularly in large events where we bring together large numbers of expensive and valuable assets, which is common in systems of systems testing during exercises. We don't just throw things together and hope that they work. We'll always do some sort of analysis to see what's feasible and where the risks lie. The key difference is that compared to an exercise where everyone's worried about their own little piece of the pie, the capability manager is really going to want to know what was proved by you spending lots of money on test. And if all you can say at the end of it is, well, if we repeat these test conditions exactly and the enemy does exactly what we propose they would do in our test point, then we know the system will work. That is not going to be good enough. Like, you're going to need to come up with some way, and comparing to a model or simulation is a good way of amplifying your data. And that's really what we're talking about here, is trying to generate conclusions that are outside the conditions of exactly what you tested, noting that they're obviously not fact, they are some sort of extrapolation. So the last one I talked about was trying to get, a lot of conclusion, I guess, for not a lot of data. What I'm talking about here is probably the opposite of that, is where we potentially have a lot of data and we're trying to get some sort of conclusion, if you like, about a different test point. So we're still looking at the same sort of problem, or addressing the same sort of problem. It's still the same combinatorial explosion issue that makes a test matrix infeasibly large to evaluate in its entirety. What's different about this particular type of testing? I'm not really talking about large OT&E, 1 or 2 events. I'm talking more about, done in that virtual and collaborative style of systems where you've got fairly loose affiliation between the systems and not necessarily the same degree of control, and also accepted variance in what the constituent systems are trying to achieve. And so I'm talking really about interface type testing here. Often that type of testing will include small or involve small groups of constituent systems that have to interface with each other. And we're really trying to answer whether our system of systems is able to effectively interoperate with each other to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. And we're not as focused on that whatever they're trying to do piece of the puzzle. And the essence of this is we're trying to gather information on a particular configuration that is or is not able to successfully interoperate with each other, and then use that data then to make some informed decision on how a different configuration or different set of configurations may be interoperable with each other. So we're still trying to produce that amplified effect of data. We're trying to take some data and use it to make some informed conclusions to other sets of proposed situations. An example question might be something along the lines of, can the current configuration of an Abrams tank exchange tactical secure UHF communications with a Growler, for instance? Or will it be likely to do so if the Growler changes to a different type of radio? Obviously, if we've already tested that, we can provide an instant answer to that question once we've gathered all of our test data together. But what if we haven't? It's not likely to satisfy the capability manager to say, I don't know, we haven't tested that. But we might be able to say something like, well, we haven't got data on that particular thing specifically, but on 97% of similar configurations, the platforms were able to successfully exchange data with each other. And that might be enough to satisfy the capability manager. So I'm going to sort of illustrate this with a little bit of a toy example. I call this a more of a Bayesian approach, and I'm not going to go into like formal statistical methods or anything like that, because lots of people have written impenetrably boring books on the topic, and if you really want to know, you can. I'm going to take a sort of more of a principle sort of approach to describing it. But in essence, if we're going to take this sort of more Bayesian approach to hypothesis testing, what we might have is a big table of data that looks something like this. So in this particular scenario, I have 4 dependent variables on the left, and I have 2 on the right that talk about whether they could exchange data or exchange voice. Now, I'll highlight that this is a toy example. You'd obviously have many, many, many more dependent variables and probably a few more independent ones as well. So this is not necessarily representative of a situation where you would use this, but it's just a little bit of a toy example that we can play with. the first thing that we really need to make this sort of Bayesian approach work for us is we need to have some sort of measure of distance between rows in our table there. So, and then we sort of use that distance measure to make some sort of inferences. So imagine we have this data here, and we want to know whether we can expect an LHD will be able to exchange data with an EA18G, the growler there. We can observe from the first and second line, we can observe from the second line there that the LHD can talk to the P8A, and we can observe from the third line there that the P8A can then talk to the EA18G, and they've successfully exchanged data in the past, if that was our interest. So one distance measure we could have is the number of hops between the sort of test configurations that we're after. So in this case, to get from LHD to EA18G, we need to go through P8A, which is 1 hop. In contrast, and you can verify this for yourself, if you wanted to go from DDG there to the EA18G, your distance would be 2. There's another candidate for, so that's one potential distance measure, is like number of hops through a graph that connects the nodes on it, constructed from your table. Another way you could do it is just by measuring the number of different values in the columns, which works quite well for categorical variables. So for instance, the difference between the first and second rows is 2, because only 2 of the columns have changed values. The difference between the third and the fourth would be a distance of 4. So there's a lot of, and that distance measure is a really, really rough gauge as to how different 2 test points are in that table. So there's a couple of different options for how you get distance. And then what you essentially do is iterate over that entire table and calculate how often different distances are associated with your question of interest. In this case, whether you can exchange data, yes or no. So you'd calculate at distance 1, how many % of times was data able to be exchanged. At distance 2, how often was it able to be exchanged? And then once you've built that model of distance compared to probability of success, then you can start to draw those conclusions. And this is a really simple scenario. What you can do is carve up the data in different ways and calculate different percentages based on different sets of dependent variables. It's not as simple as I'm presenting it here, but you can start to build those models. And once you've got enough data, then you can fairly confidently ask, all right, based on this big database of recorded interactions that I've obtained, how likely is this new interaction that I'm proposing between these other 2 things likely to succeed or not? And so it looks at it from the other side of the problem. You've got a lot of data and you're trying to generate a fairly small conclusion, but it's still trying to amplify the effect of your data. You're still trying to build a model that you can then use to inform capability manager on where their risks lie. The last point I want to make is just a couple of really small tips. The first of those is when you're doing your reporting is to try to break your report up into phases, ones that are preferably aligned with the OCD, because that's probably your best informed document on how the system is supposed to work. And I'll use the example of like a network of surveillance assets that are trying to intercept a missile or something like that. You might break it up into a detect, track, and intercept phase of the mission, and then analyze each of those individually. Because what is likely to happen is the results of one phase will affect the results of others, and that can help you determine where to invest to rectify any deficiencies that you observed. So in that example of the missile interception system, we might have a network of sensors that can detect an enemy launch within 5 seconds, and that's fine, and that's plenty of time in accordance with the specs. The tracking data from the individual sensors might be all fine and all within specs, and it all seems to be working fine. But perhaps the system architecture relies upon broadcast of a single fused solution for queuing things that are supposed to intercept missiles, like a laser or another missile or something like that. And that lags by 1/4 of a second, which means that none of the effectors are going to be able to intercept the missiles because they can't compensate for that. Clearly, in that situation, a system of systems wouldn't work, but by breaking it down into phases and looking at the constituent systems within those phases, we could probably conclude that our detection part of our system of systems is fine, and that tracking is mostly good, but just our broadcast and fusion and broadcast architectures, it may not be the way to go about it. And for the effectors, we don't really know if they work because they never got close enough to affect our missile. So, we need to sort of spin up that test point, or maybe the compensation is to buy effectors that can then compensate for the lag. Who knows? But we can make some informed recommendations on what happened based on analysing what happened in each of the phases. The other thing I'll say as a final sort of point is when you're looking at systems of systems, avoid identifying deficiencies with the constituent systems and make any conclusions and recommendations if they exist on the system of systems architecture. So for instance, if you have something, if you have a situational awareness capability that is reliant on a network of sensors, and a particular type of sensor is, half as reliable, or it's half as reliable as it should be, and it goes down all the time, and the other sensors can't compensate for it, even though it's not necessarily making the specification and its performance is less than was predicted, I'd hazard against reporting the deficiency as being, this sensor didn't work as requested, or it was unreliable. I would instead title the deficiency something along the lines of, the detection performance of the system of systems was inadequate, not attributing to a particular not attributing to a particular constituent system. The reason for that is if you do identify a deficiency related to a specific constituent system, the recommendations are probably going to end up looking at that particular constituent system, which may well not be the most effective remedy to the problem that you're experiencing. And in fact, I'd suggest if you're having problems with a particular constituent system, sinking money into that dying horse is probably not the best way to go, and you're best off beefing up your system of systems with something else, like investing in the stuff that does work. Maybe. It's very likely that things will go awry in that scenario. But that's all I had on reporting. Over to you, Note.
Thanks, Kitsch. So just to tie it in, and I know we're closing in on the hour now, just to finish off with some key themes before we open it to the floor. And we've talked about the characterizations and some different systems of system types and what that might mean. And then we've gone through the planning, conduct and reporting phases as to perhaps where the challenges lie and what the potential options might be. But the bottom line is there's no great answer here. It's going to be complex and it's going to be tough. There are a few unique tools out there, such as digital twins and synthetics in particular, that are standing out right now as a potential solution. But there's necessarily no one silver bullet. And therefore, really, if you're charged with systems of systems evaluation, you probably need to have cut your teeth running some systems T&E first, as a sort of build up in your own qualification, skills and experience before taking this on. It's clear you need to be agile and creative with how you're going to be able to make the most of limited resources in particular. So that stands out regardless of the nature or the type of your systems and systems. And I think the other thing is that the classical T&E principles, whether it was systems of system, whether it was you're testing for a single system, remains true when it comes to systems of systems. And these are things such as knowing the system under test. In this case, we're talking about knowing the system of systems, or knowing the systems under test, and the interface being between those systems. This might include such things as going back and reviewing the test reports for the component systems to make sure you understand where the strengths and weaknesses of a given system is before you go and evaluate them across the systems of systems. The old principle that everything you do is data is true. There's always, regardless of the activity being conducted, raise, train, sustain, exercise, there's options to be able to extract useful information to inform the effectiveness of the fighting force. Role relation remains critical, and once we would have considered it just for what it can do, such as, you know, the mass of the rifle was too great for being able to patrol for extended periods of time because, you know, it was way too heavy. Well, now we've got to try and apply that in a systems of systems approach. And I think the way to do that most effectively is going back to the joint capability narrative or the joint capability needs statement, and putting it into one defense capability system speak that helps the capability manager and C jobs understand what capability they have and what they don't, which is links back to Kitsch's comment before about you know, in a reporting sense, making sure you're criticizing or looking critically at the effect rather than component systems necessarily. And you know, finally, stakeholder engagement was always important, but it's you know, that's amplified in this more complex environment where there are going to be more voices in the room, perhaps with alternate agendas to the T&E campaign that you're attempting to run. All valid, of course, but you know, it is going to be a winning the hearts and mind campaign within the T&E is a critical part of the T&E campaign, if you like. And that's probably where I think the three of us would like to end it. I'm sure I'll speak on behalf of Kitsch and Weeks, which is to say thanks so much for dialing in, but we'd appreciate a lot more if there's some contribution to the to what we've had to say here, and open it up to the floor if you've got any questions.
All right, Nug, sounds pretty quiet from the other end. So if no one has any more questions, I'll give you 5 seconds to pipe up. Otherwise, we'll come to a conclusion.
I was just going to say something, if that's all right.
No worries at all.
It's Emma Vickers here. I'm the director of the Joint Data Networks sustainment team. I've got the Tactical Data Link Bureau in my section, so it was great to see the examples there in the reporting section. It was really good to see you talking about how SMEs are really key to all of this. So the SMEs on TADLs in my team, we get engaged really early on in the process. So with the really early stages of the test planning, and then we also have teams that go out and do the support in the exercises and the test conduct. So I just wanted to sort of say thank you for highlighting the importance of that, because it is something that is makes our job so much easier if we're engaged early as well, and that we're able to go through the whole process. Because when people come to us with last minute requirements, it's a bit of a scramble trying to accommodate things. And yeah, it's great to see you highlighting the importance of SMEs there. So thank you.
Thanks, Emma. I think that one of the things that we've sort of shown through the talk that we've given is that systems of systems is really, really complex, and it's just beyond being able to know everything, and reliance on individual SMEs and keeping that knowledge stream happening is fundamental to being able to achieve a good outcome. So I'm glad you guys are doing that and using those SMEs. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Are there any other questions or points that anyone would like to raise? No? All right, excellent. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank Wiggs, Nug and Kitsch for that fantastic presentation. I suppose until I started working in the acquisition space on Project Coronis, which delivered the 2 AP3CEW aircraft, I wasn't quite sure what the cronies down in the Air Warfare Centre and their T&E workforce really did. But after seeing the, I suppose, the success of what a properly resourced and executed test activity delivers from a systems of systems perspective, I know why the Air Warfare Centre sends their workforce through to either the National Test Pilot School or the Empire Test Pilot School for an 18-month period of complex training. Very, very complex. And Mick, you hit the nail on the head. It's more than one person can really deal with, right? But I'd like to thank the team for your presentation. Your anecdotes and your real life experiences presented today were correlated well with the content of the slides, and the value that it adds is really second to none. So thank you. I'd also like to thank everyone for dialing in today and being a part of the Learning Together program. Please stay tuned for our next edition, which will be in the November period. So we'll send out invites to that to everyone that attended today. But have a great night. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and thanks again.